Audio lecture of Unit 9, Contemporary West, World War I and the Russian Revolution, 1914 to 1919. First, we're going to start by talking about the causes of World War I. Nationalism, militarism, and a system of alliances all contributed to the start of World War I. We're going to start by talking about the road leading to World War I, or the factors leading to war. Sometimes you see historians use the acronym, the main causes of World War I, MAIN, and you see those listed on the right here: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. But for our purposes here, I think it's good to expand on those a little bit by looking at the crises of imperialism, which was what the entire last unit was about. That's referring to all of the clashes that happen between nations over their spheres of influence. It's just one step away from those nations fighting against each other over territories to them fighting each other in all-out war. We also need to consider what's known as the zero-sum game mindset. Most European nations believed that there was a finite amount of power in the world. That means limited amount of power in the world. And as we've discussed before, the belief was that land equals power. So whichever nation controls the most land, he ultimately has the most power. If that is true, the zero-sum game mindset comes into play in this way. Every time one went to war with another nation, they had to win, otherwise they were going to lose territory and ultimately lose power. And it would even out in the long run between the two nations fighting. If nation A, say, loses territory, they decrease their power, say, by X amount. And nation B, because they win the war, they increase their power by gaining the territory from nation A by X amount. So X minus X equals 0. If that's the case, that means that every time a nation went to war, they had to win, or they ultimately were losing power on the world stage. This is one of the reasons why so many of these nations were willing to form the alliances in the alliance systems. They needed to make sure that if they went to war, they had powerful friends behind them that could perhaps make sure that they would win if they did go to war. Another thing we need to make note about those alliances that we have talked about on the past couple of units is that they originally were designed to try to keep nations out of war, sort of acting as a deterrent. If one nation sees that if they go to war with another nation, they're going to have to tangle with more than that nation, they may be more willing to negotiate a compromise. But ultimately, these alliance systems did not keep the nations out of war. Instead, they pulled everyone into the war once skirmishes started to break out in the Balkans region, which we'll discuss as we get through this lecture. We also need to consider the arms race. That's the militarism part of it. Because of industrial technology, nations in Europe had now started to create new weapons that would be used in this war, applying industrial technology to weapons making. And this will eventually lead to an arms race between especially Great Britain, which is in the Triple Entente alliance, and Germany, which is in the Triple Alliance. So therefore, this arms race, each one of them trying to outdo the other, they keep upping the ante, building more weapons to try to outdo the other side. This will eventually lead to nations with huge stockpiles of arms, and once they have those arms, they are willing to use them when clashes break out. We also need to make reference to plans that had been put in place for war, like the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was Germany's plan to try to avoid a two-front war because of their location in between France and Russia that were allied together. This plan was put in place long before the war began, but ultimately, because it was based on 3 assumptions that proved to be incorrect, ultimately it will not keep Germany from having to fight a two-front war. We'll discuss this as we go through the following slides. Now, causes of the war, as I said, we're going to discuss some of these things that were listed on that first slide in more detail as we go through this section. We know that there were two alliances that were created dividing Europe along national lines. We discussed these back in the last unit, but just to review, the Triple Alliance had Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Eventually, they will add the Ottoman Empire to this alliance. And just so you know, Italy will switch sides in the war in 1915, a year after the war began. But before the war began, we had the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, and Italy, and we had the Triple Entente, France, Great Britain, and Russia. These we discussed in the last unit. Now, we know that rivalries between nations over colonies, over imperial colonies, and trouble in the Balkans region left European nations resentful of each other and eager for revenge in many cases. Nations began to adopt a policy of militarism as well, or readiness for war, and they established conscription to ensure an adequate supply of troops. That is a national draft, folks. World War I is where we will see almost every nation involved conscript soldiers from their populations. We also see that nationalism in these nations resulted in ethnic groups who had not become nations dreaming about their own states and perhaps pulling away from the mother country. We also need to make note that during that mass society era that preceded this, growing socialist labor movements encouraged leaders to enter the war in order to suppress internal disorder at home. We need to discuss now the trouble that happened in the Balkans region to really understand how that acted as a catalyst to set off a chain of events that led to this war. It's important to know, though, if all those other factors that we listed on that first slide had not already been in place prior to the war's beginning, this skirmish in the Balkans region that was ultimately between Serbia and Austria would have remained a localized war between Serbia and Austria. But because Serbia had ties to Russia, and Russia, of course, had ties to France and Great Britain in the Triple Entente, and because Austria, on the other side, had ties to Germany and to Italy and to the Ottoman Empire, ultimately this skirmish between Austria and Serbia basically dominoed into the First World War. Now let's talk about the outbreak of the war with the trouble in the Balkans. Serbia's determination to become a large independent state angered Austria-Hungary, and that is one of the things that started the hostilities. But again, I need to point out to you that if those other things, factors leading to the war had not already been in place, since the industrial age began and since the age of imperialism, then this would have been a localized skirmish instead of the beginning of a world war. Serbia was a nation that had claimed its independence from the Ottoman Empire back in the late 1800s. Serbia was determined to create a vast, independent Slavic state, a vision supported by Russia. Russia, as a Slavic state, wanted to support Serbia's claims to become a Slavic nation. And they greatly were opposed, however, by Austria-Hungary because they both wanted the same territory. Serbia wanted to annex Bosnia-Herzegovina to become part of the Greater Serbia, and Austria actually did annex Bosnia in 1911. This will lead to tensions between the nations. These were all things that we discussed in an earlier unit. Ultimately, this will lead to the proliferation of terrorist activities within Serbia. Nationalist groups like Gavrilo Princip's Black Hand organization ultimately will make it their motive to instigate Austria into a war. They will provoke Austria by, on June 28, 1914, assassinating the Archduke of Austria, the Crown Prince. He was not yet the emperor, but he was the next in line for the throne. His name was Archduke Francis Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Austria. He had been visiting Sarajevo in Bosnia. He and his wife were traveling there when Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb, member of the Black Hand Serbian nationalist organization, assassinated the Archduke and his wife while they were on a tour of the city in their convertible car. Austria-Hungary was outraged by the death of the Crown Prince and his wife, and they were ready to wage war on the Serbian government. Now, why would small Serbia want to, I guess you would say, poke at the hornet's nest of Austria? Because Serbia knew that they had Russia in their back pocket for support. And Austria, of course, knew that they had Germany. So ultimately, the Austrian government, they feared that Russia would support Austria, rightly so, because they knew that they were both Slavic nations. They knew that they both had interest in the Balkans region, and they were friends. So Austria turned to Germany, whom they had created an alliance with in the late 1800s, and made sure that they would have the support of Germany if they went to war with Serbia, and that would ultimately bring Russia into the equation. Emperor William II, or Wilhelm II, Kaiser Wilhelm II, as he was referred to, of Germany, promised Austria-Hungary that he would give them their full support if war broke out with Russia or with Serbia. This is known as Germany's blank check. I know very few people use checks anymore, but the idea is if someone were to give you a check without the amount filled into it, they are showing you that they will give you whatever you need and support you. That is basically what Germany was doing. They basically signed a declaration that said that they would give Austria any support that they needed if they went to war with Serbia and ultimately Russia. So, on July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia after trying to give some ultimatums to Serbia to back down. Serbia would not accept those ultimatums, and so the war began. Now, if you look at this visual up here, it shows you the different alliances here. And you see that Serbia had ties with Russia. Of course, Russia and France and Britain were all part of the Triple Entente. And you see that Austria was connected to Germany and Italy and the Ottoman Empire in their alliance as well. In response to Austria-Hungary's declaration of war, Russia's Tsar Nicholas II ordered the mobilization of the Russian army in order to support Serbia. Germany reacted quickly and declared war on Russia. But Germany recognized that Russia would probably take a long time, or at least 6 to 8 weeks, they thought, to mobilize, since Russia had not really fully industrialized prior to the war's beginning. Russia also lacked a lot of the infrastructure they would need to get supplies to the front lines. And so Germany felt as if Russia would take longer to mobilize. So to avoid a two-front war, due to the location of Germany sharing a border on the east with Russia and a border on the west with France, who is connected to Russia in an alliance, Germany will launch their plan to try to avoid that two-front war, the Schlieffen plan, which we'll discuss on a later slide. Okay, as I said before, Germany had developed a plan called the Schlieffen Plan, named after the General Alfred von Schlieffen, who created it. He was given the task by Kaiser Wilhelm II, or William II, to make a plan to avoid a two-front war if war did begin. Now, this plan was put into place even prior to the war's beginning. And it was supposed to be secret, but by the time the war broke out, most everybody knew about it. Okay, so what was the plan here? Well, it was based on 3 assumptions. Germany made these 3 assumptions, And ultimately, all three of these assumptions proved to be false. And that was why the Schlieffen Plan did not work, did not keep Germany from facing a two-front war. But here are those three assumptions. First of all, Germany felt that, as I said on the previous slide, Russia would probably take 6 to 8 weeks to mobilize fully. So in the meantime, before Russia was able to attack because they had to mobilize, it would be best if Germany tried to knock out France as a threat first. So they could concentrate all of their forces on France first, knock them out of the war quickly within 4 to 6 weeks, hopefully. Then they could focus their efforts on fighting Russia rather than fighting them both at the same time. So there would be a rapid invasion of France, sweeping through Belgium before Russia could mobilize. Okay, another assumption would be the whole thing that I just said about Belgium. Now, Belgium had declared itself neutral prior to the war's beginning. And when a nation declares itself neutral, no combatants on either side are able to enter that country. Now, one of the assumptions that Schlieffen made, however, was that Belgium, because they were good trade partners with Germany, but they were also good trade partners with France and Great Britain, and this is why they wanted to remain neutral. But Schlieffen assumed that Belgium would eventually come around and allow Germany to march through their territory, to march into France with a sneak attack from the north. France would be expecting an attack from the border that they shared, but this would catch them by surprise, and this wide sweeping movement into France from the north through Belgium would allow the German forces to encircle the capital city of Paris quickly without the French knowing what hit them. Okay, so that assumption of Belgium allowing Germany to violate their neutrality also will prove to be false, because Belgium will not be happy with this, and Belgium will actually resist the Germans marching through their territory, and this slows the Germans down a bit. The third assumption was that knowing the history that Great Britain and France had shared, the hate-hate relationship that they had had with one another for so many centuries, all the wars that they had fought against each other, Germany felt, or Schlieffen felt, that as long as Germany did not outright attack British lands, that perhaps Great Britain would not honor the alliance that they had with France and Russia, because their territories themselves were safe. So that was the idea behind the three assumptions of the Schlieffen Plan. So the idea would be that after knocking France out, then Germany would conduct a small holding action against Russia. All of these assumptions, as I said, proved incorrect because, first of all, Russia mobilized far more quickly than Germany had anticipated. They actually mobilized within 4 or 5 weeks, forcing the Germans to divert part of their forces to the Eastern Front to fight Russia before they had completely encircled France. Second of all, Belgium did mind, as I said before, Germany violating their neutrality, and they opposed this and fought against Germany doing this, which slowed Germany down. And, by the way, this also brings in the third assumption. Great Britain had actually guaranteed Belgium's neutrality as one of their trade partners. So the violation of Belgium's neutrality by Germany made sure that Great Britain would get involved in the war and would come to the aid not just of Belgium, but also of France, their ally, their begrudging ally. So ultimately, it falls apart. And because Russia mobilized more quickly than they had thought, not only are they fighting against France and Great Britain on the western front of the war, but they will also have to fight simultaneously against the Russians on the eastern front of the war. Great Britain declared war on Germany after Schlieffen violated the Belgian neutrality by demanding that German troops be allowed to pass through Belgium, as I said before. This is a cartoon that kind of shows you how all of the dominoes kind of fell into place. Each domino or person in this cartoon being representing a nation involved. By August 4th, all of the great powers of Europe were at war. Serbia and Austria were fighting against each other. Serbia brought in Russia. Russia brought in France. Because of Belgium's neutrality being violated by Germany, that made sure that Great Britain came in to support France and Belgium. And of course, Germany supported Austria, and of course, Italy being part of that alliance, as well as the Ottoman Turks. All of Europe was at war by August the 4th. No longer was it just a skirmish between the Austrians and the Serbians, but we are at all-out world war. So between 1914 and 1915, that first year of the war, there were what we call illusions and stalemate. A new kind of warfare was developed due to the new industrial technology that had been applied to making new weapons. And this brought about trench warfare. Digging of trenches was the only way one could defend itself from these new mechanized weapons. And trench warfare brought the war on the Western Front to a stalemate, while Germany and Austria-Hungary tried to defeat Russia on the Eastern Front. Now, stalemate, you need to understand, is a word that oftentimes people mistakenly think is one thing when it's really another. Stalemate, in this case, does not mean nothing is happening. Stalemate means that no real advances are made on either side of the war for almost 2.5 to 3 years. But lots of fighting is going on for no real gain at all. In fact, millions of people will die for yards of territory. No real significance being made on either side. The Western front lines barely move at all for almost 3 years. But lots of men will die in the process. All right, so one of the big things, and you're going to be doing a project on this, okay, is that governments during this time period, because they had mass media at their disposal to try to keep the public informed, they could also indoctrinate the public to react and respond in a way towards the war effort the way that they wanted them to gain the support of the public. So government propaganda had stirred national hatred towards the enemies that the nation was fighting against. Most people believed their nation's cause was just and that the war would be over quickly. And they believed that the enemy was the monster that they had to destroy. This is largely because government propaganda, posters, newspaper articles, movie footage, etc., portrayed the enemy in such a way. Propaganda was a powerful tool when focused on nationalism, and an us and them mentality will dominate most nations. We are better than them. We are more civilized than them, similar to what we saw with new imperialism. But this time it's against other Western nations. You can see an example here. This is actually a U.S. Propaganda poster from World War I after we entered the war, that last year of the war, and we were fighting against Germany. And you can see we say, destroy this mad brute. And we know that the brute, as you see there, is representing Germany for a couple of reasons. First of all, the ape is wearing a helmet, the German-style helmet with a pointy top on it. That's the common German military helmet. And he is holding a club that says culture on it, like the culture comp that Bismarck had enlisted back in the late 1800s. Destroy this mad brute, or he will take away Lady Liberty, who he's carrying off in his arms. So by defending other Western nations that we had the same ideals with, since we joined the side of the Allies, of course we mean Britain and France, we would be defending liberty throughout the world. Now, remember what I said, the U.S. did not enter the war until the last year of the war. So there are lots more propaganda posters that come from other nations prior to 1917. So this one, even though I'm saying, 1914 and 1915 and the use of propaganda, this one is actually from a couple of years after that. I liked it. I thought it painted a good picture for you to understand how the governments are trying to sway public opinion against the enemies and to support the war effort. And it worked brilliantly. Now, the Western Front, as I said before, ultimately there will be very little movement along the Western Front lines for almost 3 years of the war. But the first year, of course, we see Germany had marched toward Paris in 1914, enacting that Schlieffen Plan. They were halted by French troops, however, at the First Battle of the Marne, meaning the first battle along the Marne River. Ultimately, the Marne River will kind of be the line where the Western Front lines will be drawn, and they will remain pretty much in the same place for almost 2.5 to 3 years. Both sides on either side will dig trenches, France and Great Britain on one side versus Germany on the other. Eventually, in the southern part of the Western Front, there will be some shoring up, at least for the first year. Italy there, but remember what I said, Italy ends up joining the Allied cause in 1915. So both sides dug in these trenches, making advancement from either side very difficult, and the result was a stalemate. Remember what I said, stalemate does not mean nothing is happening. There was lots of bitter fighting going on. Millions of men were dying in the trenches, but very little territory gained on either side. This shows you the wastefulness of this kind of warfare, the lethality of this kind of warfare, deadliness. For 4 years, both sides remained virtually in the same positions due to trench warfare, digging ditches that they will live in for months at a time, bombarding each other's trenches for weeks and months at a time, people having to live in those trenches with rats, with the dead bodies, with human waste, with rainwater, with mud, with rats, with lice, terrible conditions, with constant bombardment going on. This can really damage a person, not just physically, but also mentally. Back in World War I, they referred to it as shell shock, which we now call PTSD. This is the first time we've ever seen something like this in warfare, and a lot of it had to do with these new tactics of war. Why did they dig trenches? Well, because of the new weaponry. The new weaponry were so lethal, machine guns, those kinds of things, which we'll discuss in a later slide, that the only way really one could defend themselves against them was to dig trenches, to dig into the ground, and try to outlast your opponent through these bombardments. The line or the territory that was between the two enemy trenches, of course, was called no man's land, because no man could go in that territory and survive, because they could be picked off from the other trench, from the enemy trench. This is why we call it stalemate. So the object was to try to bombard the enemy trench and kill enough of the men in the trenches before trying to go up over the top into no man's land to try to take the enemy trench, to better your chances of taking the enemy trench. Unfortunately, very little success was made at taking enemy trenches for almost 3 years. Stalemate. Lots of deaths, very little gain. In the Eastern Front, it was not much better. The Russians there was more movement, but there wasn't a lot of gains being made on the Allied side, in particular, Russia. Russia was pretty much by itself to handle the Eastern Front for the Allied powers. The Russians were defeated in both the Battle at Tannenberg and the Battle of Masurian Lake in eastern Germany. Austria-Hungary was defeated, however, by the Russians at Galicia and pushed out of Serbia. So some gains on one side, some gains on the other, which kind of evens out in the long run. So more movement, but not a lot of net gain either on either side, taking, I guess you would say, the winning side here. Germany came to Austria's aid ultimately and pushed back the Russians into their own territory, however. And from that point on, from 1915 on, Russia really is on the defensive. And they are losing ground and they are losing men. This is largely because they were not very well supplied. They had not fully industrialized, and they ultimately do very poorly in the war against the more industrialized Germans after 1915. Italy, as I said before, abandoned the Triple Alliance and attacked Austria in 1915. Italy joined France, Great Britain, and Russia and became one of the Allied powers. Russian casualties ultimately equaled about 2.5 million, almost knocking them out of the war by 1915. But they stayed in at the insistence of the Tsar Nicholas II, as well as the insistence of the other allies who did not want to end the two-front war that the Central Powers were having to fight. France and Great Britain insisted that Russia stay in the war because they needed Germany and Austria to have to continue to fight a two-front war. Bulgaria ultimately joined Germany and Austria-Hungary, and they attacked and eliminated Serbia from the war completely. We also need to make note that the Ottoman Empire, as I said before, was part of the Central Powers, and they will ultimately come into play by 1915 as well. Now let's discuss the Great Slaughter. Let's discuss a little bit more about these new weapons and the trench warfare that made World War I far more devastating than any of the previous wars we have seen. Trench warfare was a new kind of warfare that was developed in World War I largely because of the new weapons that had been created and that were being used now in this war. It was the only defense that one could find for these new industrialized weapons. So trenches are elaborate systems of defense. They're basically ditches that are dug, above one's head. They're dug deep enough that you are standing in them, and the wall is above your head. They were protected by barbed wire between the two enemy trenches. Troops lived in holes in the ground separated by a strip of land, meaning the enemy trenches but strip of land in between them was known as no man's land because no man could survive in that area. Because if one tries to take the enemy trench and go up over the top, meaning go out of the trench and into no man's land, they could be picked off one by one by the enemy trench, by those in the enemy trench. So the whole point is to try to have movement in a war, to try to gain territory, and trench warfare made that very difficult. And so ultimately, the only way you could ever make an advance by going up over the top is to try to bombard the enemy trench as hard as you possibly could prior to going over the top, to try to kill as many in the trench as possible to maximize your chances once you went into no man's land. So the attacks on the enemy trenches consisted of heavy artillery trying to wear down the enemy's barbed wire and to wear down the enemies in the trench. Then the soldiers would attempt to advance onto the enemy's trench and take it. Unfortunately, what we see happening mostly on the western front of the war is stalemate, where so many people die for very little gain on either side. This kind of stalemate warfare is very costly, very lethal, and very demoralizing. The attacks, as I said, were rarely successful because the advancing troops were often fired upon by enemy machine guns, ultimately killing millions of men. Not just the machine guns, but other weapons as well, through bombardments, throwing hand grenades over, dropping bombs from the airplanes that are now in use, or zeppelins that are in use as well. Also, you have tanks attacking trenches as well. Trench warfare was a tactic that turned World War I into a war of attrition, which basically means whichever side can hang on the longest, maybe not have a definitive victory, but can hang in there the longest, is the one that's going to win. By 1915, as I said, airplanes were added to the battlefront for the first time. And now the battle lines were not just on the ground, but also in the air. We need to now talk about two specific battles that happened in 1916, because these two battles were an attempt to end the stalemate where there was no movement at all on the Western front lines. For 2.5 years, there was no real movement that happened, no real gains on either side. And both of these battles happening in 1916 were attempts to make a change, to make that stop so the stalemate would end and somebody would have an advance. It starts with the Battle of Verdun in February of 1916, and this battle will continue until December of 1916. Now, this battle was a German offensive trying to bombard the French trenches around the city of Verdun, attacking them relentlessly for months, attacking those trenches, sending bombardments over relentlessly, like I say. They said that they were going to bleed France white, and the French soldiers responded by saying, "They shall not pass." Ultimately, this battle will not have any advance on either side. There's no real victory on either side. The Germans were not able to take Verdun. The French were able to defend it, but it's not really a victory because so many men were lost and no territory was gained. This one battle, over 1 million men were lost. We also see the Battle of the Somme, also known as the Battle of the Somme River, happening from the summer of 1916 until November of 1916. This was an Allied advance trying to take the German trench around the Somme River. A combined Allied effort, meaning both the British and the French were participating in this. Again, just like we saw the Germans do to the French at Verdun, the German trenches this time are being bombarded relentlessly by the British and French for months at a time. The Germans were able to escape some of these bombardments because they dug tunnels underneath their trenches and ultimately were able to escape some of those bombardments. When the British and French finally came over the top into no man's land, they were slaughtered by the Germans. But the Germans lost over 500,000 men in this one battle, and the British and the French combined lost more than 500,000 men as well. So if you look at these two battles in 1916, Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme, you will note that over 2 million men had died and no territory was gained on either side. That is the definition of stalemate. That is the definition of a wasteful kind of warfare. Planes, as I said, were used for the first time in World War I. Initially, they were used to spot enemy positions, but eventually they began to be used to attack ground targets, especially enemy communication lines. In the beginning, pilots shot at each other with pistols, but were later equipped with machine guns on the nose of the planes. Now, this was a tricky thing because they had to develop a timing mechanism that would shoot the machine gun so it could avoid shooting through the propeller that powered the plane. The Germans were the first to develop this in these fighter planes, but they would quickly be copied by the British and the French. The Germans usually use also their giant airships known as zeppelins, or what we call blimps, to bomb cities, but these were easily shot down by anti-aircraft guns. Most of the time, the zeppelins were used to bomb civilian targets. You see the picture at the top here of a German zeppelin flying over the city of London. That's the Tower Bridge there. Attacking the civilian targets was another thing that we saw happening a lot in World War I, to try to wear down one's opponent, to try to demoralize the people on the home front. This is why we refer to World War I as the first real total war, where every single person in a society was involved in the war effort in one way, shape, or form, and impacted by it drastically. A world war. With the war at a stalemate, especially on the Western Front, Both the Allied powers and the Central powers looked for new allies to gain an advantage. As I said before, I mentioned this in a previous unit, the Triple Alliance will eventually be a quadruple alliance prior to the war's beginning, and the Ottoman Empire is the one that was added to that Triple Alliance. Now, another thing I need to remind you guys of is Italy will actually pull out of the Triple Alliance, and in 1915 they actually joined the Allied powers, or the Entente, if you will. Now, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, what used to be called the Triple Alliance. This also consisted of Bulgaria, was another part of it, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. So the Ottoman Empire was now part of the Central Powers in Central Europe. The Allied powers still remain France, Great Britain, and Russia. And now Italy, in 1915, was added to this mix. In exchange, they were asked to join by the British and the French to help attack the weak link of the Central Powers, which was seen to be the Ottoman Empire. And they demanded that if they do this, they get some territories from the area of the Ottoman Empire in exchange once the war was over. Now, we do see some attacks happening on the Eastern Front as well. Most of the Eastern Front was actually handled by Russia fighting against Germany in the border between them, the border area between them, since they share a border. Russia will fare very poorly in this war. They are not nearly as advanced militarily. They're not nearly as advanced, industrially as Germany was either. And so they will suffer great losses as a result of that. But on the southeastern part, or theater of the war, the Allies, really the British and the Italians, will attempt to attack the Ottoman Empire. The British in particular will attack the Ottoman Empire at Gallipoli. And ultimately, you see the Battle of Gallipoli illustrated here on this map, this moving map. The British will use imperial troops from Australia and New Zealand as a way to try to gain this coastline area along the Aegean Sea. They were actually not able to gain a good advantage here. The Turks were waiting for them, and it was a slaughter. It went very, very poorly, and it was seen as a loss for the British and a win for the Ottoman Empire. However, this win for the Ottoman Empire was really just temporary, because the British will use different tactics and start to destabilize the Ottoman Empire by attacking them in the weakest part of their empire, in the Middle East. We'll talk more about that later. There is a clip from a movie called Gallipoli from the early 1980s that starred a very young Mel Gibson that you can click on that link there at the bottom. I also have it embedded in the module for you. The war soon became a world conflict when a British officer, who will be nicknamed Lawrence of Arabia, encouraged the Arab princes in the Middle East to revolt against their Ottoman overlords. This is known as the Arab Revolt, or the Arab Revolts. Sometimes you will see it. And this is how the British, after the loss at Gallipoli, decided they would destabilize the Ottoman Empire, attack them in their weak underbelly of the Middle East. They encouraged the Arab nationalists to rebel against the Ottoman Empire, and they made promises to them. The British sent them aid. They sent them troops to help them rebel against the Ottoman Empire. It worked. It destabilized the Ottoman Empire and gave the Allies a way in to crush the Ottoman Empire. Promises were made to the Arab nationalists by the British officers that they would receive their independence once the war was over for their help in destabilizing the Ottoman Empire. Unfortunately, that will not be delivered. That promise will not be delivered upon. And at the end of the war, when the Ottoman Empire is on the losing end, not only is their entire empire divided up, but the Arab nationalists were not given their independence. Instead, they become part of, some of them become part of the British Empire, some of them become part of the French Empire. And this goes a long way to explain a lot of the mistrust that many in the Arab world still have towards Western nations. Great Britain and Germany implemented also a series of naval blockades against one another to try to cut off their supply lines. Ultimately, this will these blockades will end up with naval battles against each other. And what we see happening eventually is the Germans had developed submarines, or what they called U-boats, that were under the water. And so now, not only on the water do we have naval battles happening, but under the water. And these U-boats could torpedo ships that were trying to deliver supplies to Great Britain and France, including American cargo ships, because even though we had declared ourselves neutral at the beginning of this war, we continued to supply our best trade partners, which were Great Britain and France, with supplies that they could use against the Germans. So we really weren't so neutral as we like to claim. On May 7th, 1915, the Germans used their U-boats and they torpedoed and sank the British ship, the Lusitania. About 1,100 civilians, including over 100 Americans, died on this cruise line ship. And this caused the American public to start to turn against Germany and perhaps support the idea of America getting officially involved in this war. Now, America will not officially get involved just yet. It will not happen until 1917, but this is the beginning of the United States determining that we may need to take a more active role in this European conflict, as we used to call it before. Germany will have to end unrestricted submarine warfare after the sinking of the Lusitania to avoid a conflict with the United States, but they will reinstate unrestricted submarine warfare by 1917. And when they do and they attack U.S. cargo ships, that will be another, I guess you would say, straw, close to the breaking of the camel's back that will bring the United States into the war. We'll talk more about that on a later slide as well. In 1917, also, we see that Admiral Holtzendorf convinced the German emperor to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. This is when they will start attacking the U.S. cargo ships, as I mentioned before. At this point in 1917, Germany was antagonizing the United States, but they were still hoping that the United States would not get involved officially. They were not wanting the U.S. to continue to supply the Western allies with materials, though, because that made it harder for Germany to fight against Great Britain and France if they were getting supplies from the U.S. So that's why unrestricted submarine warfare started up again. Germany tried to hedge their bets also by trying to get the U.S. involved in another conflict so we would not be able to get involved directly in World War I, and perhaps also stop supplying the British and the French. They did this through trying to reach out to Mexico. Remember the Mexican-American War, where the United States took most of the southeastern, what is now the southeastern United States, away from Mexico. That happened in the middle of the 1800s. We discussed it in an earlier unit. Well, Germany tried to encourage Mexico to attack the U.S. in 1917 to take territories back from the Mexican War, hoping that this would make the U.S. not able to supply Great Britain and France with supplies because they would be fighting their own war at home against the Mexicans once again. This Zimmermann telegram, it was a telegram from the German officials to the Mexican officials, was actually intercepted by the United States spy network. And when it was revealed to the U.S. government that what Germany was trying to do, trying to get Mexico to attack the U.S., and Mexico refused, by the way, this was the last straw. And that we will formally declare war on Germany in late 1917. And so the last year of the war, between late 1917 and late 1918, the United States will join the Allied cause against Germany. The United States will retaliate, as I said, by joining the Allied powers in late 1917. Almost simultaneously with us entering the war, however, Russia on the Eastern Front ends up pulling out of the war. They end up signing their own surrender with Germany because they were then undergoing a Russian Revolution that was happening, Bolshevik Revolution, overthrowing the Tsar and instilling a communist regime towards this end of the war. And they will pull Russia out of the war. So Germany will not have to fight a two-front war anymore, but they have a new enemy that they have to fight against on the Western Front, the United States. And the United States' addition to the Western Front kind of resuscitated the Western allies of Great Britain and France, who were beleaguered after 3.5 years of fighting. And that was just enough to push the war towards its end and towards Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire having to surrender. More on later slides. Now, the impact of total war also needs to be addressed. Total war meaning, World War I became a total war with governments taking control of the economy. So, free enterprise kind of goes out the window during a war, and the government basically says what's going to be produced where, because it has to be done for the good of the war effort. And also, civilians have to ration a lot of their goods because those things are needed for those fighting on the front lines. World War I eventually became this total war when the countries involved called for complete mobilization of their resources and their people. The war affected the lives of all citizens in the nations involved. Countries drafted or conscripted tens of millions of men to fight on the front lines. Governments also rationed food and supplies and materials so the soldiers could get what they needed on the front lines. We also see with total war that imports and exports were highly regulated by the government. So again, no free enterprise. Transportation systems and industries were temporarily taken under government control as well. And in order to mobilize all of the resources of their nations for the war effort, European nations set up planned economies. Planned economies basically means government control of all of the economic maneuverings of a nation in terms of, getting ready for the war effort and maintaining the war effort. So this is not free enterprise, this is government control. President Woodrow Wilson in the United States declared that the men and women at home helping with the war effort were no less part of the Army than the soldiers at war. And so trying to keep morale high on the home front was something that you saw being pushed in propaganda and in newspapers, not just in the United States, but throughout all of the countries participating in the war. And you all were going to be doing a project based on propaganda as well. You see here one from the United States, a World War I propaganda poster. It says, "We are serving you. You save food. Well-fed soldiers will win the war." So the rationing of food at home was so more food could be sent to the front lines for the soldiers who were fighting and dying for the cause. As public support for the war began to waver, especially in Europe, since they had been fighting, by 1917, they had been fighting for almost 3.5 years. So as public support for the war began to waver, governments expanded their powers to stop internal dissent against the war effort. Authoritarian regimes relied on force to quiet opposition. They would also use propaganda and persuasion to try to keep those at home in support of the war effort. The British Parliament allowed the government to even arrest protesters, people who were protesting the war, as traitors to the British government. So free speech kind of goes out the window during this emergency situation. Newspapers were also censored, and were not printing everything that was happening on the war front, because terrible things were happening on the war front, and the people at home could not really be told the truth about those things, or they may not support the war effort and continue to send men to fight. Women also took on new roles during the war by filling jobs traditionally done by men, including working in the factories to help build airplanes and munitions and other weapons that would be used in war. This is why, after the war, many jobs were taken from these women and when men returned home to the workforce. And when women started to agitate more for some rights because of this, this is finally when the women's suffrage movement that had been being pushed for a generation by this point will finally get some recompense. The role women played during the war had a positive impact on the women's movement, and in many areas, women gained the right to vote after the war. They will gain the right to vote in Britain, in France, and even in the United States after World War I is over. They can no longer be ignored because they did keep things running at home, and they built munitions that were necessary for the war. They built the airplanes, they built the weapons, they kept the home fires burning. They can no longer be viewed as less than by the men in their societies. Now let's talk a little bit about another thing that goes on in the midst of World War I. As I mentioned before, Russia was pretty much alone fighting against Germany on the eastern front of the war, not the southeastern front, but the eastern front, in the border that they shared. Russia was not doing well in the war, largely because they had not fully industrialized, and ultimately this will cost them greatly. The people in Russia began to lose hope, and they stopped supporting the war effort. And this ultimately will cause problems for the Tsar, Nicholas II, the last Romanov Tsar. This will eventually lead to a revolution at home, which will force Russia to pull out of the war, as I mentioned before, and change the government to a communist totalitarian regime. So the background to the Russian Revolution, let's cover first. Worker unrest and the Russian Tsar's failures in the war led to the revolution that began in March of 1917, but was completed with the Bolshevik Revolution in November of 1917. All right, the Russian military suffered heavy losses during the war due to a lack of experienced leaders and adequate weaponry because they had not sufficiently industrialized before the war began. They also lacked infrastructure to try to get supplies to the front lines, and many soldiers were starving before food ever arrived to them. Interestingly enough, the peasants were also starving because their food was being requisitioned to be sent to the front, and then it would rot before it ever got to the soldiers, so it was wasted. It was a complete failure. Tsar Nicholas II insisted on taking charge of the armed forces when the war began, leaving his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, at home to make the decisions in the royal court. And ultimately, she and Nicholas II came kind of under the sway of a maniacal monk, and I use the term monk very loosely, named Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin gained Alexandra's confidence and began to influence her in political decisions. There was even a rumor that they were having an affair. But in reality, the reason why the royal family trusted him so much is that he seemed to make their sickly son, the heir to the throne, Alexei, feel better. Alexei had a blood disorder called hemophilia. It was the inability of the blood to clot properly. And any little cut or even a bruise, he could bleed to death. It could be the end to his life. But when he was around Rasputin, Rasputin seemed to have healing powers over the boy. Now, as a matter of fact, probably had something to do with hypnosis. He felt better, but he really wasn't better. But Gregory Rasputin was actually a vile, vile man He committed many atrocities. He, committed murders, rapes, all sorts of terrible things. Yet this evil man seemed to have the royal family under his hold, if you will, under his power. And this will cause the Russian nobility at the royal court to even start to turn against the Tsar and the Tsarina as well. So you have workers' unrest, you have peasants starving to death, you have nobles angry over the sway that this vile human being has over the royal family. That's a recipe for disaster, not to mention the poor showing on the front lines of the war. After experiencing a series of economic and military disasters, conservative aristocrats finally assassinated Rasputin in December of 1916. This man was hard to kill. It took like 3 tries to kill him. In March of 1917, working class women started to lead a series of strikes in Petrograd, shutting down all the factories in the cities, refusing to work because they were refusing to continue to support the war effort. The Tsar ordered the soldiers to end the demonstration, but many of the soldiers instead, who had grown weary of the war, and especially the fact that they weren't being very well supplied, they were being sent to the slaughter with even no guns to fight with, joined the protest instead and refused to fire on the crowds. The tide is turning against Nicholas II. Eventually, the Duma, the legislative body that had been created back in 1905 but had been suspended by Nicholas II when the war began, decided to start to meet again and ask the Tsar to step down. Now, of course, they met without his permission, but at this point, they saw themselves as a more valid government than the Tsar because they had the support of the people and the Tsar did not. Without the support of the army, which was now turning against Nicholas II as well, Nicholas II had to agree, and the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty came to an end. Nicholas was forced to abdicate his throne. He gave up his throne. He and his family will go and live in exile in the countryside of Russia. They will not be killed, not yet. That will happen with the Bolsheviks. But a new leader, the provisional government, will be established under the leadership of Alexander Kerensky. Alexander Kerensky and this provisional government were put in place to try to decide what to do about the war effort so they could then decide what kind of new government to form in Russia. Unfortunately, they really did not have a choice and decided to stay in the war against the wishes of the majority of the population. Now, why did they do this? They, just like Nicholas had, felt pressure from the Western allies to stay in the war. France and Great Britain threatened to take munitions and supplies away from Russia that they had been sending into Russia once they destabilized the Ottoman Empire. They were able to get supplies to Russia from the south, and they swore they'd take those away from them if they did not continue to fight against Germany on the Eastern Front. The problem was they could not continue to fight against Germany on the Eastern Front. They were all alone, and they were suffering greatly. Of course, the Western allies want Russia to stay in the war because they want Germany to continue to be forced to fight this two-front war, because that way they could not focus all of their forces on just one front, on just the Western Front. But the many people who wanted to end the war were very upset with the decision by the provisional government under Kerensky to stay in the war. And this will lead to a second revolution. Now, the Duma forcing the Tsar out, this happens in March of 1917. So the provisional government is established in March of 1917. This is kind of seen as the first wave of the Russian Revolution of 1917. Soviets began to form in the army units and in factory towns and in rural areas to challenge the government's power under the provisional government in Kerensky, largely because they no longer supported the war effort, and Kerensky refused to take Russia out of it. So these Soviets, or committees, that's what Soviet means, started to meet, and they started to foment some rebellion against the government. This is where Lenin will come into play. Now, from czars to communists, how does this work? Lenin and the Bolsheviks gained control and quickly overthrew the provisional government by November of 1917. How does this happen? Let's talk about this process. The Bolsheviks were actually a small Marxist party that turned to violent revolution under the leadership of V.I. Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. Lenin believed that the Bolsheviks should gain control of the Soviet groups that were now fomenting rebellion against the provisional government under Kerensky. And if he could gain control over those Soviet groups and use them to overthrow the provisional government, this could be the beginning of the workers' revolution. Lenin was a Marxist. The Bolsheviks were Marxists who believed that this was the opportune time for the workers' rebellion to happen, to seize control of the means of production, pull Russia out of the war, and establish a true communist government. The Bolsheviks promised to, first, end the war. Second, redistribute land equally among the people. Third, transfer governmental power to the Soviets. And the fourth, transfer the factories and the industries from the capitalists to committees of workers. Okay, so this was all based on Marxism. The only thing is, Lenin put his own spin on Marxism because there were not really enough workers to rebel on their own, and he saw that they needed leadership. So he put his own spin on Marxism and said that there needed to be a dedicated elite group of Marxists, of revolutionaries that would deliver the revolution to the people. And that elite group would be the Bolsheviks. The Soviets will give power to the Bolsheviks, the supporters of Lenin, and they will launch this revolution. Now, on November 6th, the Bolshevik forces under Lenin's leadership took control of the government by storming the Winter Palace of St. Petersburg, and they outwardly turned over power to the Congress of Soviets. In reality, this power was in the hands of the Bolsheviks that supported Lenin's communist takeover of the Russian government. The Bolsheviks renamed themselves communists and began to focus on pulling Russia out of the war. On March 3rd, 1918, Lenin signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, or the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, with Germany, which basically was the Russian surrender to Germany. Germany gave up Eastern Poland, the Ukraine, sorry, not Germany. Russia had to give up Eastern Poland, the Ukraine, Finland, and the Baltic provinces, all to Germany. So 25% of Russia's European territory had to be given to Germany. That's a lot. Germany, however, is important to know, will never be able to fully capitalize on this victory because within the year, they will be the losers in the war. They will lose the war to the Western Allies because the Western Allies now have the United States as part of their fighting force. So ultimately, we see simultaneously with Russia pulling out of the war and the Eastern Front closing, now the Germans can focus all their attention on the Western Front. But the Western Front gained an advantage with the entrance of the United States with fresh troops and resuscitating the Allied cause. After this happened, after the Russian Revolution happened and after Russia exits the war, things are not calm for the Bolsheviks. Civil war soon erupted in Russia. The Allies, the ones that were against Russia pulling out of the war, were concerned about a communist takeover, especially because they had been sending so many materials and aid to Russia. They had munitions and weapons that they had sent to Russia to fight against Germany on the Eastern Front of the war. Are those weapons and munitions now going to fall into the hands of the communists? So the Allies started to send troops and materials again to aid anti-communist forces, ones that wanted a Republican form of government, ones that had supported the provisional government under Kerensky. These would be known as the White Forces. and they would be battling now in a Russian civil war against the communists that were led by what was called the Red Army. This will happen between 1918 and 1920. The first serious threat to the communists came from Siberia, followed by the Ukrainians and the Baltic regions. The royal family was also, during this civil war, Russian civil war, I'm sorry, it happened from between 1918 and 1921, or 22 actually. The royal family that had been in exile in the countryside, living, under guard, but, being allowed to live, this was the time when Lenin decided that it was time that they should die. Okay, the royal family was imprisoned in the Ural Mountain areas, and they were eventually murdered by local Soviets under the direction of the Bolsheviks. It was thought that some people in the white movement that were trying to end the communist regime were pro-monarchy, wanted to return Russia to the monarchy, even though other whites wanted to return it to a republic. But the point is, the Soviets or the Bolsheviks believed that as long as the Tsar and his family, including his heir, the boy, Alexei, were alive, they were a threat. So this is when the entire royal family, including the dog, were murdered in the Russian countryside in the Urals. There's a picture up there at the top that shows you a picture of the room where they were murdered, and the reason the wall is torn up is because that's where they were shot. So the Tsar, the Tsarina, all of their children, and even the dog were murdered. Leon Trotsky, who was the right-hand man of Vladimir Lenin, played a major role in the Red Army's success against the White forces. The Russian Civil War will actually end with the Red Army, or the Bolsheviks, being victorious over the White forces. And this is largely due to Leon Trotsky and his organization of that Red Army. Leon Trotsky was such a devoted supporter of Lenin that many thought that he would be the successor to Lenin. However, Joseph Stalin will have other plans. We'll talk more about that in a later lecture. War communism is another thing that we need to discuss. This was a kind of putting Russia on a wartime footing, even though they had just gotten out of the war, in order to support the Red Army cause against the White forces in the Russian Civil War. And this is what I meant by Leon Trotsky playing a major role in the success of the Red Army. Okay, regular supplies would be sent to the Red Army. They would be well equipped, well organized, and they will be able to make mincemeat ultimately of the White forces, even though the White forces had support from the Western allies that are still fighting in the war. The Cheka is also something that is created during this time period. The Cheka, or the Red Secret Police Force, began a Red Terror to instill fear and destroy any opposition to the communist regime. After the Red Army had gained enough of an upper hand, the Cheka, or the Secret Police Force, will be sent around eliminating any and all threats to the power of the Bolshevik or Communist Party. So just like we saw terror tactics being used in the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution, a similar situation will happen with this secret police force, which is really a not-so-secret police force, eliminating any and all opposition to Lenin's reign as the communist dictator. Foreign troops that were stationed in Russia made it easy for the communist government to call on patriotic Russians to fight foreign attempts to control the country, because actually they were foreigners trying to control the country. So it was a good way for the Bolsheviks to rally support of the regular folk behind the Red Army cause. By 1921, the communists were in total control of Russia, and by 1922, they could declare that they were in full control. The Civil War left the communists resentful towards the Allied powers, however, and moving forward, we're going to see that resentment between Russia and the West become deeper and deeper. Even though they will put differences aside eventually to fight together one more time in World War II, not at the beginning of World War II, later in World War II. we will see eventually this divide continue even after World War II, after the defeat of the Nazis, into the Cold War. So that's just kind of a, a foreshadowing of where we're going in the future in this course. The last year of the war. The new German Republic and the Allies signed an armistice eventually, ending the war on November 11th, 1918. How does this happen? What happens in the last year of the war to turn the tide against the Germans and Austrians that were left only having to fight a western front of the war after Russia pulls out? After the withdrawal of the Russians, Germany had a renewed hope for victory. Erich Ludendorff decided to make one last grand offensive. He was the head of the German forces. One last grand offensive in the West to try to end the military stalemate. The Germans launched their final attack in March of 1918, but were defeated at what is called the Second Battle of the Marne. This last German offensive was unsuccessful, largely because the United States troops had arrived on the ground to support the Western Allies, to support France and Great Britain on the ground at about that same time. Had the Germans been able to launch this offensive earlier, before all of the U.S. troops had been able to arrive, perhaps they would have had more success. So the United States arrives and the German offensive will fail at the Second Battle of the Marne, March of 1918. The Allies refused to make peace with an autocratic imperial government in Germany, however. So they force William II or Wilhelm II off of the throne before they will negotiate any kind of armistice or ceasefire with the Germans. Sailors in Kiel actually started to mutiny while councils of workers and soldiers took over the civilian and military offices in Germany. And so the Social Democrats, led by Friedrich Ebert, who had been part of the German Reichstag or the German parliament, announced now forcing Kaiser William II into exile and now announcing that Germany will be a democratic republic. It will be known as the Weimar Republic because the capital will be moved to Weimar instead of being in Berlin. It was signed, this Weimar Republic, the leaders of this Weimar Republic, new leaders, will be the ones that will sign the armistice with the Western Allies. And this will be the end of the war. The armistice ultimately was signed on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 11/11/11 in 1918. And this is why we still celebrate what we now call Veterans Day on November 11th. In the rest of Europe, it's called Armistice Day. After the war, the German Communist Party, that was not in power in this Weimar Republic, formed in opposition to the Social Democrats that had been in charge of the German Reichstag in this new Weimar Republic. And they tried to seize power in Berlin and in Munich, two major cities in Germany. The revolts were crushed and the leaders of the communists were captured and killed. So the German Communist Party will be effectively not really wiped out, but nullified because of this. But this will lead to other groups filling that void, other fringe groups like right-wing extremists, like the Nazis in the interwar years, which we'll talk more about in the next unit. Now, what about Austria-Hungary after the war was over? Austria-Hungary collapsed. Okay, the empire collapses and is dismantled. Ethnic groups finally, that had been fighting for independence for so many years, finally gain their independence, forming now a smaller Austria, just a nation state of Austria, a smaller Hungary, a smaller Czechoslovakia, and a smaller Yugoslavia, all separate nations now. What about the peace settlements? Just because the armistice was signed does not mean that the peace has been negotiated. The peace settlement that ends, well, there's several peace settlements that end World War II, are highly controversial. Probably the most controversial of all of the peace treaties is the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles punishes Germany ruthlessly. and it establishes new nations and creates a League of Nations to try to solve international problems. But it will have trouble from the start. After the armistice was signed in November of 1918, by January of 1919, representatives from 27 victorious Allied nations met in Paris to make a final settlement of World War I. But the big four were the dominant ones. Of course, they represented the British, the French, the United States, and Italy. United States President Woodrow Wilson became the spokesman for what he hoped would be a new world order based on democracy and international cooperation. Woodrow Wilson was an idealist, and he hoped that the fruit of World War I, out of all of this destruction, rising up out of the ashes like a phoenix, would perhaps be the spread of democracy throughout Europe, with the United States leading by example and international cooperation. So this would be the war to end all wars. That was nice ideals, but that's not the way things work out. David Lloyd George of Great Britain was sent as the delegate for Great Britain, and Georges Clemenceau, who had been in control of the French government during the war, will be there for France. Both of these powers, Great Britain and France, had spent the entire war fighting on the Western Front, the terrible Western Front stalemate with millions and millions of deaths, fighting against Germany. They were aching for revenge. They were not wanting to make this easy on Germany at all. And they wanted Germany to have to pay heavy, heavy reparations. The word reparation means repair, and it can be economic reparations as well as territorial demands, losses, etc. Germany was not even invited to the peace treaty conference. Okay, first and foremost, this is unheard of. When a war ends, both sides come together to hash out the details of the peace settlement. Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire were not even invited. They were forced to sign the peace treaty even though they were not invited. If they refused to sign the peace treaty, the war would continue. And the Western allies, those big four, recognized that Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire could not afford to fight any longer, so they would have to accept the terms. That will be problematic in the future because Germany felt stabbed in the back by the treaty terms that they received that are so harsh. They sued for peace based on what they thought they would get based on Wilson's 14 points, which I'll explain here in a minute, but they got something very different. Another notable exclusion from the peace treaty was Russia. Russia was not able to attend because the civil war between the Red Army and the White forces was going on at the time. And they really weren't invited by the Western Allies because the Western Allies were frankly ticked that Russia had signed its own surrender with Germany and pulled out of the war, so Germany didn't have to fight a two-front war anymore. So they weren't invited either. All right, so Wilson's 14 points. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, had developed what he thought would be a good blueprint for a peace settlement even before the war was over. And he was hoping that these 14 points, which was based on things like national self-determination and spread of democracy and international cooperation, that these would all be things that would be enshrined now in a peaceful world. He advocated also that no one nation would be blamed for this war, that all of the nations had to accept some culpability for what they did to precipitate the war, the alliance systems, the arms race, all of that. He wanted to demilitarize everyone, to amp down arms race. He wanted to say we should no longer have alliances because they do nothing but bring people to war instead of avoiding war. These were all very idealistic things, and the whole idea of we all share some blame in this war happening was appealing to the losing nations because Germany kind of felt like, yeah, okay, well, you don't have to accept all the blame for the war, and Austria the same way, then that's good. If the victors have to accept some blame for the war, then that's good. Well, that's not what Great Britain and France want. They want revenge, and they have a lot of power to say what these terms should be. Woodrow Wilson will have to negotiate away most of his 14 points, not all of them, but most of his 14 points, because he really, really, really wants to get 1 point more than any other point: the creation of an international organization, peacekeeping organization called the League of Nations. The conference accepted Wilson's proposal of this international peacekeeping organization, a League of Nations, to try to prevent future wars. But they would only accept it if he negotiated away many of his other points, including the idea that all should accept some responsibility for the war. No, Great Britain and France are going to insist that the war, the blame for the war, be placed solely on Germany. Now, folks, we know that Germany was not the only factor as to why this war happened. They were a big one, yes, but they were not the only one. We know this. All right. The Treaty of Versailles with Germany had several treaty terms that you do need to remember, you do need to know, okay, that caused animosity and resentment among the German people towards the Western Allies. And during the interwar years, fringe groups like the Nazi Party will run with this. It will run with the idea that we sued for peace based on Wilson's 14 points, but we got something very different. We were stabbed in the back. We were forced to accept this unfair treaty. All right, so what's in this Treaty of Versailles with Germany? First and foremost, the War Guilt Clause. Article 231 of the treaty said that Germany and Austria were solely responsible for the war, and even more than Austria, Germany. They had to accept that they were culpable for the war and that they had to pay harsh reparation payments to be paid directly to the Allied governments for all of the war damages. They also insisted on a reduction of Germany's Navy and Army and an elimination completely of its Air Force, so disarming Germany. This went against rules of sovereignty. The German nation did not really see the fairness in this, but they were forced to sign it anyway. They really did not have a choice. The return of the Alsace and Lorraine will be returned to France. They had been Germany's since the Franco-Prussian War. Sections of Eastern Germany were also given to the creation of a new Polish state and a demilitarized zone along the Rhine River, known as the Rhineland, that was the area between the natural border between France and Germany, would be demilitarized on both sides as to form a kind of buffer zone to protect France from future German aggression, if you will. These were all part of the treaty terms that Germany was forced to accept, Germany and Austria, but in particular, Germany. Now, new nation states, as I mentioned, emerged from the German, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian empires that were dismantled. Russian Empire was dismantled with the Russian Revolution, remember. So that was all part of it too. These new nations that emerged were places like Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. Officially, Poland becomes its own nation state. Czechoslovakia, Austria will be an independent state, and Hungary will be an independent state. Romania acquired more land as well, and Serbia, remember Serbia, right? Having a role in the starting of this war with their skirmish with Austria. Serbia actually formed the center of a new state that will be called Yugoslavia. Compromises had to be made during the peace talks. As a result, almost every Eastern European state was left with ethnic minorities that seemed out of place from the new nations that were created. The Ottoman Empire was also divided up and taken as mandates by France and Great Britain. This is what I meant when I said before that Great Britain and France carved up the Arab nations for themselves rather than delivering on the promises of independence that they had made to the Arabs when they helped, fight against the Ottoman Empire. A mandate is an authorization granted by the League of Nations to a member nation to govern a former German or Turkish colony. The territory was called a mandated territory or a mandate. So officially, the League of Nations will recognize British control over Mesopotamia or Iraq, French mandate of Syria, independent Republic of Turkey, smaller, of course, British mandate of Palestine, and independent Iran. Now, one of the things that I do want to say, however, is that the mandate system basically means these victors are getting new colonial territories that had once been part of those old defeated powers. And ultimately, there will be a lot of friction in these nations amongst the native populations under these new colonial rulers as well. So we'll see all that as we move towards World War II as well. France took control of Lebanon and Syria as well. Great Britain received Iraq and Palestine, as I mentioned before. Now let's talk a little bit about the social implications of this war, the lost generation. We're going to talk more about this in class, but I did want to at least point out to you guys that those that returned home from the war, having fought in the war, shell-shocked from what they experienced, they will never be the same. So many died in this war that they refer to it as a lost generation. Almost a complete generation of men were killed. But those that weren't killed, those that returned home, would never be the same, would never be whole. And that's why it's also referred to as a lost generation. So there's some poetry from the Great War here that I'm going to read. There's anti-war poetry, and we'll discuss this more in class. This is The General by Siegfried Sassoon. Good morning, the general said, when we met him last week on our way to the line. Now the soldiers he smiled at are most of them dead, and were cursing his staff for incompetent swine. He's a cheery old card, grunted Harry to Jack, as they slogged up to Arras with rifle and pack. But he did for them both by his plan of attack. Here's Suicide in the Trenches, also by Sassoon. I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life in empty joy, slept soundly through the lonesome dark, and whistled early with the lark. In winter trenches, cowled and glum, with crumps and lice and lack of rum, he put a bullet through his brain, and no one spoke of him again. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye who cheer when soldier lads march by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go. Suicide was something that happened often to try to escape the horror of the trenches. Siegfried Sassoon, who wrote this anti-war poetry after experiencing the trenches himself, a British poet, said, I am not protesting against the conduct of the war, but against the political errors and insincerities for which the fighting men are being sacrificed. Here is another one from Wilfred Owen. It's called The Parable of the Old Man and the Young, and it uses the theme of Abraham and Isaac, but it has a different ending than the Bible story. So let's read this. So Abram rose and clave the wood and went, and took the fire with him and a knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spake, and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron, but where the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the night to slay his son. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. Now here's where the story changes from what's in Genesis. Instead of stopping like Abraham did. But the old man would not so, but slew his son and half the seed of Europe, one by one. Here's another Wilfred Owen poem called Dulce et decorum est, which means it is great and right, it is sweet and great to die for your country. Bent, and of course that's being sarcastic. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of disappointed shells that dropped behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes, the thick green light as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from forth corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patri mori. It is good and sweet to die for your country. Again, anti-war poetry. You can kind of understand after these men returned home from the war ruined. Here's some historical context for Dulce et decorum est. Wilfred Owen wrote what is widely considered to be some of the finest war poetry in English about his experiences in the First World War. Owen joined the armed forces in 1915 out of a sense of patriotic obligation, and very quickly underwent a transformation from patriotic, high-spirited young man to a disillusioned, war-weary soldier. Owen survived most of the war, but was killed on November 4th, 1918, at the age of 25, 7 days before the armistice agreement that signaled the end of fighting was signed.